Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Secrets channel. Tonight we step quietly into a world of creaking wagon wheels, wool blankets stiff with frost, and a horizon that looks far too wide to be friendly. You arrive just as the first real winter storm rolls across the early American frontier, the kind of storm that doesn't politely introduce itself. It just shows up, sits down on your chest like a block of ice, and informs you without words that you are either prepared or you are not. And judging by the way the wind is already sneaking through the cabin logs, you probably won't survive this. At least that's what it feels like. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I love hearing where you're listening from, so share your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, and imagine the sound of that wind again, long and low, like it has nowhere else to be for the next 4 months. You stand inside a rough-hewn cabin that still smells of sap and fresh axe cuts. The walls are made of logs notched together with admirable optimism but questionable insulation. Snow pushes itself into every tiny seam. The fire is going, yes, but fires on the frontier are less about coziness and more about negotiation. You feed them constantly, and in return they agree not to let you freeze. Hunger, you quickly realise, is just as dangerous as the cold. Out here, food is not about pleasure, it is about heat. Every bite you take must become warmth in your body. Every calorie is fuel thrown onto the invisible furnace inside your chest. You are not dining, you are stoking. One widely accepted historical fact is that early American pioneers depended heavily on preserved high-calorie staples during winter, because fresh food simply wasn't available once the ground froze solid. There were no grocery stores, no quick supply runs, and certainly no cheerful delivery drivers trudging through snowdrifts. If you didn't store it months ago, you weren't eating it now. You move toward a wooden chest in the corner. It's not glamorous, doesn't glow with abundance, but inside is the difference between endurance and disaster. When you lift the lid, the smell hits first salt-smoke dried grain and something faintly sweet. These are not ingredients for recipes, these are the building blocks of survival. You find sacks of cornmeal heavy and pale, a slab of salt pork wrapped in cloth, dried beans that rattle like little stones. Maybe a small keg of molasses if the family was lucky, or careful, or both. Nothing here spoils easily. That is the entire point. Winter on the frontier is not just cold, it's immobilizing. Roads disappear, rivers freeze, livestock require more food than they give back. Hunting becomes unpredictable and sometimes impossible. So pioneers planned their winter diet around foods that could sit quietly for months and still keep a person alive. You run your hand across the cornmeal sack. It's ground maize, a crop that had already sustained indigenous communities for generations before settlers arrived. Now it becomes the backbone of countless pioneer meals, boiled into mush, baked into dense bread, or fried into rough cakes. It is simple, filling, and remarkably efficient at keeping a body functioning in the brutal weather. Outside, the storm intensifies. Snow taps against the cabin roof like fingers drumming on a table. Inside, someone stirs a pot. The sound is hypnotic, slow, circular, patient. Cooking in this environment is less an art and more a continuous act of maintenance. Fires must be kept low enough not to waste wood, but strong enough to cook. Water must be melted from snow, which takes time and fuel. Even preparing a basic meal is an investment. And yet there's comfort in the rhythm. A curious little tidbit recorded in some settler accounts mentions families deliberately eating small amounts of fat before bed because they believed it helped the body burn warmer through the night. Modern nutritionists might phrase things differently, but the instinct wasn't entirely wrong. Fat is dense energy, and these people understood energy mattered even if they didn't talk about calories. You sit close to the hearth now, feeling one side of your body warm while the other remains suspiciously cold. That unevenness becomes normal. Frontier life is full of half measures like that. The meal being prepared tonight is plain. Painfully plain by modern standards. But to you, after a day of hauling wood and reinforcing shutters against the wind, it smells extraordinary. There's also the psychological weight of winter food. These meals are repetitive, predictable, and sometimes monotonous, but they're reliable. Reliability becomes its own kind of luxury. Not everyone adapted easily, though. Researchers still debate whether the monotony of preserved foods affected morale as much as the isolation did. Some journals from the era describe deep gratitude for simple meals, while others complain endlessly about the sameness. The truth, like most human experiences, probably sat somewhere in between, gratitude flavoured heavily with boredom. You notice how carefully each portion is measured. No one is taking more than necessary, not because of strict rules, but because everyone understands the math without saying it aloud. Winter is long, supplies are fine. Final? And spring is not guaranteed to arrive before they run out. The fire pops loudly, sending a brief shower of sparks upward. For a moment, the cabin smells richly of smoke and rendered fat. That scent will cling to everything: clothes, blankets, even hair. Frontier winter has a smell. It is equal parts wood smoke, damp wool, and slow-cooked food. You begin to understand something essential. Eating here is inseparable from weather labour and planning. There is no casual snacking, no absent-minded opening of a cupboard. Every mouthful connects directly to effort made months earlier: planting, harvesting, salting, drying, packing. It's a delayed conversation with your past self. And as the wind howls outside, that past self suddenly feels like the most important person you've ever known. Tonight's meal is served in simple bowls. Steam rises in ghostly ribbons. You cradle the warmth in your hands before you even think about tasting it. Heat first, flavour second. Always heat first. The storm will continue for hours, maybe days. But inside this small circle of firelight, something steady is happening. The pioneers are doing exactly what humans have always done in hostile climates, turning stored food into survival one slow meal at a time, and you sitting among them begin to feel that same quiet calculation settle into your bones. How much is left? How long must it last? And what exactly can be made from it tomorrow? The questions linger as the fire crackles lower, inviting the long winter night to stretch ahead. Morning arrives quietly, if you can call it morning, when the sky looks like a sheet of unpolished tin, and the sun seems unwilling to participate. You wake not to an alarm, but to cold air touching your face and the faint, steady sound of someone already moving about the cabin. Out here, sleep follows darkness, not clocks. And in winter, darkness is generous. The first task of this day is not conversation. It is not even standing up. It is coaxing the fire back to life. You kneel near the hearth where last night's embers hide under grey ash like tiny stubborn stars. A bit of kindling, a careful breath and patience. Always patience. Soon a flame answers, and with it comes the promise of warmth, and just as importantly, breakfast. Without fire, the food you carried all this way is nearly useless. You turn again to that wooden chest, the travelling pantry that had to survive hundreds of miles of jolting wagon travel. Everything inside was chosen months earlier with ruthless practicality. Taste mattered far less than durability. A well-documented reality of westward migration is that pioneer families planned their provisions based on what could last without refrigeration for extended journeys. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, and sometimes rice formed the core because they resisted spoilage and could be combined in many ways. Variety did not come from having many ingredients. Variety came from changing how you cook the same few things. You loosen the tie on a cloth sack and scoop out coarse flour. It feels cool and dry between your fingers. This flour might already be months old, ground back east before the journey even began. Yet it is still perfectly usable. That reliability is everything. Nearby sits a small barrel. When opened, it reveals salted meat packed tightly in brine. The smell is sharp enough to make you blink. Preservation by salt was not subtle, but it worked. Salt drew moisture out of the meat, slowing bacterial growth and allowing it to last through seasons that offered no second chances. Breakfast begins as a simple mixture of flour, water, and maybe a pinch of salt if supplies allow. You stir it into a thick paste and shape it into rough cakes. These are not delicate. They are not meant to be. They go straight into a pan set over coals where they cook slowly, forming a crust sturdy enough to survive handling with cold, stiff fingers. As they cook, someone slices a bit of pork, rinsing it first to remove excess salt. This step alone shows how carefully pioneers balance preservation and edibility. Too much salt left on the meat could make it nearly inedible. Too little salt during storage could have meant spoilage weeks ago. The smell that fills the cabin now is deeply comforting. Hot grain, sizzling fat, wood smoke curling through everything. It is not fancy, but it is alive. Interestingly, some wagon train diaries describe families naming their supply boxes as if they were dependable friends. One woman reportedly called her flour barrel Old Faithful, because in her words it never argued, never ran off, and always helped when things looked bleak. Frontier humour leaned heavily toward whatever kept spirits from freezing along with everything else. You sit with your portion, noticing how dense it feels. These foods are intentionally heavy. They digest slowly, releasing energy over hours. A light breakfast would have been a liability in sub-zero weather. Packing the wagon months earlier had required foresight that bordered on prediction. Families had to calculate how much each person would eat for an entire journey, plus the first winter. Misjudge and you might face hunger before spring planting even began. Scholars continue to discuss how accurate these calculations really were. Some evidence suggests many travellers underestimated their needs, while others packed extra at the expense of space for tools or personal belongings. The balance between food and mobility was a constant gamble, and no one knew the outcome until it was too late to change it. You imagine that moment back on the trail, standing beside a wagon, deciding whether to bring another sack of meal or leave it behind for the sake of lighter travel. That decision now echoes into this frozen morning. Outside, the wind has eased through the cold remains sharp enough to sting your lungs. Smoke rises straight from the chimney, a rare sign of calm weather. These pauses between storms are when people take inventory both literally and mentally. You watch as the remaining supplies are checked again. Lids lift, quantities estimated by eye, no scales, no measuring cups, just experience and intuition. Food here is counted not in recipes but in days. How many mornings like this remain in that sack? How many suppers in that barrel? Each calculation is quiet. No one announces concerns aloud unless necessary. Anxiety wastes energy, and energy must be conserved just like wood or firewood. You take another bite. It is plain, yes, but there is satisfaction in its solidity. The pioneers often describe such meals as staying food, meaning it stayed with you, held you upright through hours of labour and cold. That phrase captures everything. This is not cuisine meant to excite, it is meant to endure. The cabin slowly brightens as more light filters through the frost-coated windows. Someone begins preparing another pot, already thinking ahead to the midday meal. Cooking once and eating twice saves precious fuel. Efficiency becomes habit so quickly that it no longer feels like effort. You realise something subtle but profound. Packing the wagon larder was not just about storage, it was about carrying time itself. Every preserved item represented summer sunlight, autumn harvest, and long days of work now transformed into winter survival. You're eating seasons that no longer exist, and as the last of the breakfast cakes disappear, the connection between preparation and endurance becomes impossible to ignore. The pioneers did not simply bring food with them. They brought a carefully measured extension of the past designed to carry them into an uncertain future. The fire settles into a steady burn. Another day has begun. Outside waits snow chores and distance. Inside waits another careful decision about what to cook next. You brush flour from your hands, already aware that this routine repeated countless times is what will carry you through the coldest months still ahead. The rhythm of the day settles quickly into something both practical and strangely soothing. You notice that nearly everything revolves around the hearth. It is kitchen, furnace, workshop, and gathering place all at once. Without it, the cabin would become an icebox within hours. With it, even the simplest ingredients can be transformed into something sustaining. You shift a heavy iron pot closer to the flames using a hooked rod. These tools are few, but each one matters. A cast iron kettle, a skillet blackened from years of use, a long-handled spoon worn smooth by hands that stirred thousands of meals before this one. Frontier cooking depends less on equipment and more on knowing how to manage heat with precision. One well-established detail from historical records is that most pioneer families owned only a handful of cooking implements, often just one pot and one pan, because iron was expensive and difficult to transport over long distances. That meant meals had to be prepared sequentially layered in stages, or combined into one dish. The The modern idea of multiple burners and specialised cookware would have seemed impossibly luxurious. You begin by heating water. Even this is deliberate. Snow must be melted first, then brought to temperature. It takes far more snow than you expect to produce a usable amount of water. A full bucket melts down to something disappointingly shallow. The process teaches patience very quickly. Into the warming pot goes a scoop of cornmeal stirred slowly to prevent lumps. This becomes a thick porridge, sometimes called mush. It is one of the most reliable foods available because it requires so little to make and provide steady energy. The texture is plain but comforting. The warmth spreads through your hands as you stir, and the faint scent of grain rises with the steam. In winter, the act of cooking is as valuable as eating because it warms the cook while it prepares the meal. Nearby strips of salted pork are placed into the skillet. The fat begins to render popping gently. That sound becomes a familiar companion throughout the season. Rendered fat is never wasted. It is saved, reused, and added to other dishes to increase calories. Every bit of energy is precious. Some pioneers even referred to this collected fat as kitchen treasure, guarding it carefully from abils or overuse. A few humorous accounts describe a children being warned more sternly about wasting grease than about tracking mud indoors. It sounds amusing now, but when fat equals survival, priorities shift dramatically. You notice how meals are rarely cooked all at once. Instead, ingredients cycle through the same pot. After the pork is browned, beans might be added later using the same vessel, absorbing both heat and flavour. This method conserves fuel, water and effort. Researchers still debate how much these cooking patterns were influenced by necessity versus tradition, carried from European peasant kitchens. Some argue settlers simply adapted old world habits to new conditions. Others believe the frontier forced entirely new improvisations. Either way, the result is a cuisine shaped by endurance rather than creativity. You taste the mush once it thickens. It is mild, almost neutral, but that neutrality allows it to pair with anything. A bit of pork, a drizzle of molasses if available, even just salt. Its versatility explains why it appears again and again on the winter table. The fire must be managed constantly. Too hot and precious wood disappears quickly. Too low and cooking drags on, leaving food underdone and bodies underwarmed. You find yourself watching flames the way a sailor watches wind adjusting logs with quiet attentiveness. Outside, the world remains locked in white silence. Inside, the cabin hums with small activity. A lid clinks, a spoon scrapes, someone splits kindling. These sounds replace what summer once provided in birdsong and insects. Cooking also serves another purpose. It structures time in a season when days blur together. Morning preparation leads to midday reheating, which leads to evening simmering. Without these markers, winter could feel endless and shapeless. There is also an unspoken reassurance in seeing food transform. Raw ingredients look uncertain, a bubbling pot looks like security. You begin to understand why stews and porridges dominate pioneer winter meals. They are forgiving, they allow substitutions, they can stretch small amounts of meat to feed many people. And perhaps most importantly, they stay warm longer than roasted foods. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier journals tells of families deliberately leaving a pot near the fire overnight, not to cook further, but to prevent it from freezing solid. In extreme cold, even prepared food could become rock-hard by morning if neglected. Keeping it close to the embers meant breakfast could begin faster the next day. You glance at the walls of the cabin, noticing how soot has slowly darkened the logs above the hearth. Winter leaves marks not just on the land, but on the spaces people inhabit. Everything absorbs smoke, heat, and effort. The meal is served simply, bowls filled, no ceremony, no elaborate table setting. Yet there is gratitude in the quiet way everyone eats. Warm food means the system is working, the fire is holding, supplies are still sufficient, and that knowledge eases tension more effectively than any seasoning could. You take another bite, feeling the heat spread outward through your chest and shoulders. It is not dramatic, but it is steady. This is how pioneers survived winter, not through heroic feasts, but through consistent, methodical nourishment repeated day after day. As the pot is cleaned and returned to its hook already prepared for the next use, you realise there is no true separation between cooking and living here. they are the same act. To tend the fire, to stir the pot, to measure each handful carefully is to declare quietly but firmly that you intend to see spring. The light outside begins to fade again, though it feels like the day barely began. Another evening approaches, another meal will follow, and the tools waiting by the hearth will once again turn the simplest provisions into warmth against the cold pressing in from every side. By now you have learned that winter survival rests heavily on one particular food that appears again and again no matter how much you might wish for variety. Salt pork. Sits wrapped in cloth, packed in barrels, tucked into corners of the larder, like a reliable if somewhat overbearing guest who refuses to leave. You unwrap a slab and feel its firmness. The meat is dense, pale, and thoroughly cured. It does not look especially appetizing to modern eyes. Yet for pioneers, it was one of the most dependable sources of energy available during the cold months. Historical records show that salt pork was a dietary cornerstone across much of early America because it could last for months without spoiling when properly cured. The heavy salting process removed moisture and created an environment where bacteria struggled to survive. In an era without refrigeration, that reliability made it invaluable. Before cooking, you must prepare it carefully. The meat is often soaked or rinsed to remove excess salt. Skip this step and the result could be nearly inedible. Even with rinsing, the flavour remains assertive. This is not delicate seasoning, this is preservation you can taste. You cut a small portion and place it into the skillet. As it heats, fat begins to melt, pooling slowly and releasing a savoury aroma that fills the cabin. That rendered fat is as important as the meat itself. It becomes cooking oil flavouring and a source of calories added to otherwise plain dishes. You notice how little is used at one time. Even families with a decent supply rationed it carefully. A few cubes might season an entire pot of beans or cornmeal. The goal is never indulgence. The goal is extension. Some settlers joked that pork on the frontier had 9 lives because it kept reappearing in different forms long after you thought it had been used up. A scrap today flavoured tomorrow's broth, which then enriched the next day's bread. Nothing vanished without contributing something first. The smell alone seems to lift spirits. In the monotony of winter meals, the richness of pork provided a welcome change. Fat carries flavour and flavour carries morale. That connection between taste and emotional endurance was understood even if no one explained it scientifically. There is also a practical reason this food mattered so much in freezing conditions. Fat contains more than twice the calories of carbohydrates or protein by weight. Pioneers did not calculate energy values the way modern nutritionists do, but they recognized through experience that fatty foods help them work longer and feel warmer. You stir the pork into a pot of beans that has been simmering since morning. The broth deepens in colour, becoming heartier. What began as simple legumes now feels like a meal with substance. Scholars continue to discuss how healthy this diet really was over long periods. Some argue that reliance on salted meat contributed to nutritional imbalances, while others point out that sheer caloric density was necessary to survive physically demanding winters. Survival often took precedence over balance. You sit near the fire watching the pot bubble slowly. Outside, snow reflects what little daylight remains, casting a pale glow through the window. Inside, the warmth feels earned rather than given. Another small but fascinating detail appears in personal journals from the time. Some families brought special wooden tea-token boxes designed specifically to hold cured meats lined to discourage pests and help regulate moisture. These boxes were treated almost like safes opened with care and closed immediately after use. Protecting the pork meant protecting the family. You take a taste from the pot. The saltiness is noticeable but not overwhelming now that it has spread through the beans. Each bite feels grounding, like something meant to anchor you against the cold winds rattling the walls. Meals like this were rarely eaten quickly. People lingered near the fire, letting both the food and the warmth do their work. Eating too fast meant losing that gradual heating effect, and nothing was rushed unnecessarily in winter unless it had to be. You realise how much trust settlers placed in preservation techniques learned long before they ever stepped onto the frontier. Salting meat was an old method carried across oceans, refined by generations who also faced harsh seasons. On the American frontier, that inherited knowledge became essential. The cabin grows quieter as evening deepens. The fire snaps softly. A kettle hums at the edge of the coals, ready for the next use. The sense of routine builds a kind of calm. You know what tomorrow's meals will likely include, and strangely that predictability feels reassuring. Winter is uncertain in many ways, but not in this one. As long as the salt pork remains, there will be flavour, fat and strength enough to continue. You wrap the remaining portion carefully and return it to storage, aware that this single ingredient must last weeks longer. Each time it is used, the decision carries weight. Too much now could mean too little later. And so the cycle continues. A small cut, a careful rinse, a slow rendering beside the fire, again and again through the long season. It is not glamorous, it is not varied. Yet this humble preserved meat forms one of the quiet foundations of pioneer endurance, turning stored summer labour into the strength needed to face another frozen night. You settle back as the meal finishes, feeling that familiar spreading warmth, knowing that tomorrow the same slab will be unwrapped once more and will once again help hold winter at bay. If salt pork is the backbone of winter meals, then cornmeal is the steady drumbeat that never quite stops. You begin to notice that hardly a day passes without it appearing in some form. It is there at breakfast, reappears at supper, and sometimes fills the quiet space in between, when hunger returns faster than expected. You reach again for the sack, surprised by how much of it has already been used, and how much still remains. Ground corn stores well, travels well, and most importantly grows well in many parts of North America. That made it one of the most dependable crops for settlers, pushing into unfamiliar territory. Agricultural historians widely agree that maize became central to frontier diets because it yielded more food per acre than many European grains and adapted to different soils and climates. For families trying to establish themselves quickly, that productivity could mean the difference between stability and scarcity. Preparing it requires little effort but constant attention. Today you mix cornmeal with hot water to make a thick dough. Yesterday it was boiled into mush. Tomorrow it might be baked into what settlers often call journey cake later, shortened to Johnny cake. Same ingredient, different texture. Just enough change to keep meals from feeling identical. You flatten the dough into a rough round and set it in the skillet greased with saved pork fat. The edges begin to crisp while the centre firms slowly. The smell is warm and faintly sweet, a welcome contrast to the sharper scent of salted meat. Cornmeal's versatility allowed pioneers to adjust meals based on what else they had available. A handful of beans could be added for substance. A drizzle of molasses could turn it into something resembling a treat. Even without additions, it provided reliable nourishment. There is also evidence that many settlers learned new ways of preparing corn from native communities they encountered. Techniques such as soaking ground maize or cooking it for long periods improved both texture and digestibility. These exchanges, sometimes cooperative and sometimes tense, shaped what ended up on the winter table. A curious detail appears in letters from the period describing how families judged the success of a corn harvest by how long their meal supply lasted into winter. Running out early carried a particular dread since alternatives were harder to produce. People spoke of their corn stores almost the way sailors spoke of fresh water. You turn the cake carefully so it does not crumble. The process demands patience. Cornmeal lacks the gluten that gives wheat bread elasticity, so it must be handled gently. Many a hurried cook ended up with a pan full of fragments rather than a tidy loaf. Researchers still discuss how much settlers missed wheat-based breads they had known before migrating. Some accounts describe longing for lighter textures, while others suggest people adapted quickly and came to appreciate corn-based foods on their own merits. Taste, it seems, can change when survival depends on it. You slice the finished cake and watch steam rise into the cool cabin air. It is dense, yes, but satisfying. Each bite requires chewing, which slows eating, and makes the meal feel more substantial. That mattered during winters when food had to last. Another small but telling anecdote survives from a frontier memoir in which a child complained about eating cornmeal so often that her mother jokingly replied they might as well name the family after it. Humour softened repetition, turning monotony into something manageable. You sit with your portion near the fire, noticing again how warmth and food blur into the same experience. The heat from the skillet lingers in the bread itself, as if the meal carries a bit of the hearth with it. Corn also had the advantage of being usable at nearly every stage of processing. Whole kernels could be boiled, cracked corn could be made into hominy, finely ground meal produced bread or porridge. This flexibility meant that nothing from the harvest went to waste. The sack is folded closed again and placed carefully back in storage. You find yourself already calculating how many more cakes it might yield. Even without measuring tools, you begin to develop an instinct for quantity, the same instinct pioneers relied upon daily. Outside, the snow has formed a crust that glitters faintly under weak sunlight. It looks almost inviting until you step into it and feel the cold push through your boots. You return quickly inside, grateful for the simple meal waiting there. Meals like this do not excite conversation. Instead, they create a steady rhythm that allows life to continue despite the weather. Stir, cook, eat, conserve, repeat. You begin to understand why cornmeal became such a symbol of endurance on the frontier. It was not rare or luxurious, it was constant. And in a season defined by uncertainty, constancy itself was deeply comforting. As evening approaches, preparations quietly begin again for the next use of that same ingredient. Perhaps boiled this time, perhaps fried once more. The variations are small, but they are enough. And so the sack remains within reach, ready to answer tomorrow's hunger, just as faithfully as it did today, holding within it the simple power to keep winter from gaining the upper hand. There comes a point in the winter when stored food alone does not feel like enough. Not because it is gone, but because the body begins to crave something fresher, something that did not spend months in a barrel or sack. That is when talk quietly turns to hunting. You step outside into air, so sharp it makes every breath feel newly minted. Snow reaches well past your ankles, sometimes to your knees, depending on where the wind decided to sculpt its drifts. The landscape is still almost deceptively calm, but survival here requires movement. Winter hunting is nothing like the images often imagined in paintings. It is slow, deliberate, and uncertain. Animals conserve energy just as humans do, which means they move less and hide more. Tracks in the snow become precious clues, each one read like a line of text. Historical accounts confirm that many pioneer families supplemented their winter diet with wild game when conditions allowed, including deer rabbit and occasionally wild turkey. Fresh meat provided nutrients that stored foods lacked and helped break the monotony of preserved fare. You follow a set of tracks, carefully noticing how sound behaves differently in the cold. Snow muffles footsteps, but brittle branches can betray you with a single crack. Hunting becomes a balance between silence and persistence. Success is never guaranteed. Some days yield nothing but cold fingers and a longer walk back to the cabin. Yet even an unsuccessful outing serves a purpose. It reminds you what lies beyond the walls and keeps skills sharp. When game is found, every part is used. Meat is roasted or stewed. Bones are simmered for broth. Hides become clothing or blankets. Waste is not simply frowned upon, it's unthinkable. One lesser-known story from frontier life tells of families thanking a successful hunter with the best seat near the fire rather than praise. Warmth was considered reward enough. Words were saved for more pressing matters. You carry what you have managed to bring back, feeling both tired and relieved. The return to the cabin is always marked by the same welcome sensation as the door closes behind you. The smell of smoke, the glow of coals, the feeling of stepping out of danger into effort already in progress. The fresh meat is cut into pieces and added to a pot almost immediately. Winter temperatures slow spoilage, but caution still rules. A stew begins to form, combining stored staples with this rare addition. Historians still examine how significant wild game actually was in winter diets. Some evidence suggests it was an occasional supplement rather than a primary food source, while other records describe communities relying on it more heavily during lean years. The truth likely depended on location, weather, and skill. As the pot simmers, the difference in aroma is unmistakable. Fresh meat carries a richness that salted pork cannot replicate. It feels like a reminder of the living world outside the snowbound stillness. You stir slowly, watching steam rise in soft clouds. The act of combining hunted food with stored ingredients reflects a larger pattern of frontier life. Survival rarely came from one source alone. It came from layering resources together. There is also a psychological lift that follows a successful hunt. The meal feels earned in a different way than one assembled entirely from storage. effort meets reward in a visible immediate form. You taste the broth as it develops, noticing how it seems lighter yet fuller at the same time. Even a small amount of fresh meat can transform an entire dish meant to feed several people. Outside daylight fades quickly again, but the mood inside feels subtly different tonight. A touch more conversation, a hint of satisfaction. Winter remains harsh, but moments like this create small islands of relief. You realise that hunting during storms or between them is less about abundance and more about resilience. It provides variety, yes, but also reassurance that the land still offers something despite the season's severity. The bowls are filled, carefully portions measured, so the benefit lasts beyond a single meal. No one forgets that tomorrow may bring another stretch of impassable weather. As you eat, the warmth spreads through you, once more joined now by the knowledge that effort outside the cabin has strengthened what was already waiting inside. The fire crackles steadily. The pot remains close at hand in case another serving is needed later. And winter continues vast and patient, while within these walls, another day's balance between stored and gathered food has quietly tipped in your favour. As the days pass, you begin to notice another quiet hero of the winter table. It does not sizzle like pork or arrive with the excitement of fresh game. It simply waits dry and unassuming in a sack or barrel until called upon. Beans. Lots of them. You scoop a handful into a wooden bowl and hear the soft clatter as they land. They are small, hard, and seemingly unremarkable, yet they represent one of the most dependable food sources pioneers had during the cold season. Food historians point out that dried beans were a staple across frontier settlements, because they stored exceptionally well and provided a strong combination of protein, fibre and calories. Unlike fresh vegetables which vanished with the first frost, beans could last an entire year if kept dry. Preparing them requires foresight. They must be soaked often overnight to soften before cooking. That means tomorrow's meal begins today, a pattern that becomes second nature. You pour melted snow water over them and set the bowl near the hearth where it will not freeze. This slow preparation fits the rhythm of winter life. Nothing is rushed because rushing wastes energy. The beans absorb water, gradually swelling as if waking from a long sleep. By morning they are ready to simmer in the iron pot. You add a small piece of pork for flavour if available, along with whatever seasonings remain. Often that means little more than salt. Yet as the hours pass, the mixture thickens into something hearty and deeply satisfying. One charming detail appears in several pioneer letters that describe beans as a quiet food, because they could cook unattended for long stretches while families focused on chores. A pot might hang over the fire most of the day, filling the cabin with a steady, comforting aroma. You stir occasionally, feeling the warmth rise against your face. The sound is gentle, a slow bubbling that seems to match the pace of falling snow outside. There is science behind the simplicity, though pioneers would not have described it that way. Beans release energy slowly when eaten, helping maintain strength over long periods of physical work. In a winter environment where every task requires effort, that steady fuel mattered immensely. Researchers continue to examine how these humble foods shaped health on the frontier. Some argue that beans helped offset the heavy reliance on salted meats, while others suggest nutritional deficiencies still occurred due to limited fresh produce. The discussion remains ongoing, shaped by fragmentary records and regional differences. You taste the stew after it has cooked for hours. The texture is soft but substantial. Each spoonful feels grounding, as if it anchors you against the cold pressing at the cabin walls. Beans also had the advantage of stretching easily. A small amount could feed many people when combined with grain or broth. This made them invaluable during periods when supplies ran low and creativity became necessary. A lesser-known anecdote from a Midwestern settlement tells of a family who accidentally spilled a pot of cooked beans into the fire. Rather than waste them, they salvaged what they could, brushing away ashes and serving the rest. The story was retold for years as both a lesson in thrift and a reminder that pride had no place in survival. You begin to understand how such foods built a sense of reliability. Unlike hunting, which could fail, or crops which depended on seasons, beans simply waited. They did not spoil easily. They did not demand immediate attention. They were patient partners in endurance. As the meal is shared, conversation remains soft. The repetitive nature of winter eating no longer feels strange. Instead, it forms a steady backdrop to daily life. The same pot, the same ingredients, slight variations that mark time more subtly than any calendar. Outside, the wind returns, brushing snow against the cabin in dry whispers. Inside, the pot is left near the fire even after everyone has eaten. It will remain warm for later, ready to offer another portion without extra effort. You realise that these meals are less about flavour and more about continuity. Each pot of beans represents another day managed successfully, another stretch of winter crossed without disaster. The sacks are checked again and tied carefully shut. There is reassurance in their weight. As long as they remain, there is food that can endure as long as the season demands. You settle near the hearth, feeling that familiar combination of fatigue and comfort. The storm outside may last through the night, but inside something steady persists. And tomorrow, when the fire is stirred back to life, those same beans will still be there, ready to begin the process again, proving once more that survival often depends not on dramatic solutions, but on simple foods that refuse to fail. After weeks of relying on what has been stored, cooked, and carefully rationed, you begin to notice how attentively pioneers look at the landscape itself, even in winter. At first glance, it seems barren, locked beneath snow and silence, but the experienced eye knows that not everything edible disappears with the frost. You pull on gloves, stiff with cold, and step outside with someone who understands where to search. The snow crunches faintly beneath your boots as you move toward the edge of a stand of trees. The air smells clean, almost sharp enough to taste. It may seem surprising, but historical journals describe settlers continuing to forage during winter whenever conditions allowed. Certain roots, nuts cached by animals, and even inner tree bark could be gathered as supplemental food. These finds rarely formed full meals, yet they added nutrients and variety when it mattered most. You kneel beside a patch where the snow cover is thinner. Using a small tool, you dig carefully, uncovering a root that had been marked before the first snowfall. Planning ahead often meant noting where edible plants grew during warmer months so they could be retrieved later. The work is slow, fingers numb quickly, but each successful find feels like discovering a hidden reserve. Some accounts mention pioneers collecting the inner bark of certain trees such as pine, drying it and grinding it into flour during desperate periods. It was not pleasant, but it was nourishing enough to extend other supplies. One traveller wrote that it tasted like chewing the memory of a forest, which is poetic considering the circumstances. You gather what you can carry and return to the cabin, brushing snow from your coat. Inside, the additions are cleaned and chopped before being added to a pot already simmering. Historians still debate how widespread winter foraging actually was. Some suggest it played only a minor role except in emergencies, while others believe it was a regular practice for families with strong knowledge of local plants. The evidence varies widely depending on region and experience. As the ingredients cook, they release subtle aromas, earthy and slightly sweet, different from stored grains or salted meat. Even a small change in flavour lifts the spirit. After weeks of repetition, novelty can be as valuable as calories. You notice how carefully these foods are treated. Nothing is tossed casually into the pot. Each piece represents effort and awareness, a reminder that survival sometimes depends on noticing what others might overlook. Foraging also created moments of connection with the land that winter otherwise tried to erase. Instead of seeing only hardship, settlers learned to read signs beneath the snow to recognize that life continued quietly out of sight. A lesser-known note from one frontier diary describes children being especially skilled at spotting edible remnants because they were closer to the ground and more curious about small details. Their contributions, though modest, were taken seriously and often praised. You stir the pot slowly, watching these gathered foods blend with beans and cornmeal. The result is not a dramatic transformation, but it is enough to remind everyone that winter has not completely severed their link to the growing world. There is also practicality in this effort. Stored supplies last longer when supplemented even slightly. A handful of roots added to stew can stretch a meal just enough to matter over weeks. You taste the mixture and notice how the flavours feel more rounded, less stark. The difference is subtle but unmistakable. Outside, the snow begins falling again, covering the places you searched as if erasing evidence of the morning's work. Yet you know those places remain waiting beneath the surface just as they did before. This pattern of seeking small resources mirrors the larger pioneer mindset. Survival was rarely about one grand solution. It was about dozens of modest actions that together created resilience. As evening settles, the cabin fills once more with the familiar warmth of cooking and firelight. But tonight there is an added sense of having drawn something directly from the land despite the season's resistance. You sit with your bowl aware that even in winter's grip there are still quiet gifts to be found for those willing to look closely enough. And as the storm closes in again, you carry that knowledge with you. Another small assurance that the frozen world outside is not as empty as it first appears. By the time winter settles into its longest stretch, you begin to appreciate that much of what you're eating now is really the result of work done months earlier, under very different skies. The meals simmering on the hearth are quiet reminders of summer, heat, autumn, harvest, and long days of preparation that once felt exhausting, but now seem almost miraculous. You open a small storage crate and find jars sealed with wax, cloth bundles tied with string, and carefully wrapped packages stacked like fragile promises. These are not everyday foods. These are preserved supplies brought out thoughtfully, sometimes sparingly, because they represent foresight. One well-documented fact about early American homesteads is that preservation techniques such as drying, pickling, smoking, and storing in root cellars were essential to surviving winter. Without these methods, families would have faced severe shortages long before spring planting could begin. You lift a jar containing dried apples, their surfaces wrinkled but still fragrant. Months ago they were sliced and laid out to dry in the sun. Now, when added to water and warmed near the fire, they soften and release a faint sweetness that feels almost luxurious after weeks of savoury fare. Nearby hangs a string of dried herbs gathered before the frost. Even the smallest pinch can transform a pot of beans or stew. The change is subtle, but it breaks monotony and reminds everyone that flavour has not vanished entirely from the world. Preservation was not simply practical. It required careful timing and knowledge. Vegetables had to be harvested at the right moment, fruits dried before spoilage, and meat smoked thoroughly enough to last, but not so much that they became unusable. A charming detail found in several household records notes that families often turned preservation days into communal efforts, with neighbours helping one another slice salt and store foods. These gatherings were busy and serious, yet they also carried a sense of shared purpose that strengthened relationships long before winter isolation began. You add a handful of those dried apples to a pot, watching them slowly rehydrate. The scent that rises is gentle and comforting, like a memory rather than a fresh ingredient. Historians still discuss how evenly these preservation skills were distributed among settlers. Some argue that families with prior farming experience adapted easily, while others struggled during their first seasons and learned through hardship. The variation in knowledge could shape how well a household endured its first winter. The act of opening preserved food also carries emotional weight. Each jar used now cannot be replaced until another growing season comes. That awareness encourages careful portions and thoughtful timing. Nothing is opened casually. You stir the pot and see how the apples blend into the stew, adding both flavour and a bit of needed nutrition. Dried produce helped provide vitamins otherwise scarce in a winter diet dominated by grains and meat. Another lesser-known practice involved storing certain vegetables like squash or turnips in cool underground pits lined with straw. These makeshift cellars used the earth's natural insulation to keep food from freezing while preventing spoilage. When uncovered months later, the vegetables could still be edible, though often with a stronger taste. You imagine the satisfaction of digging into such a store during deep winter, finding something that still resembled the harvest. It must have felt like uncovering treasure. Inside the cabin, the preserved foods merge with daily cooking routines. They are not replacements for staples like cornmeal or beans, but companions that add variety and extend endurance. The fire glows steadily, reflecting off jar glass and iron surfaces. Outside, another cold evening gathers. Inside, summer's labour quietly sustains the present. You take a bite and notice how the slight sweetness changes the entire dish. It is not dramatic yet. It refreshes the palate and, perhaps more importantly, the spirit. Preservation represents a bridge across time. Each stored item connects past effort to present survival, allowing families to carry warmth from one season into another. As the jars are sealed again and returned to their places, you realise how much trust pioneers placed in their own preparation. They depended on skills practiced months before believing that careful work then would answer hunger now. The wind rises once more, brushing snow against the cabin walls, but inside the evidence of planning surrounds you in quiet rows and bundles. Winter may be long, but it is not faced empty-handed. It is met with food shaped by patience, knowledge, and the determination to make abundance last far beyond its natural season. As winter deepens, you start to notice that meals are rarely prepared for just one person, or even one immediate family. Food like warmth becomes something shared whenever possible. The idea of the communal pot emerges naturally not from tradition alone, but from necessity and quiet cooperation. You see it now as another kettle is placed over the fire larger than usual. Ingredients come from several small stores rather than a single pantry. A scoop of beans from one household, a bit of cornmeal from another, perhaps a scrap of pork contributed by someone whose barrel is still reasonably full. This kind of pooling was not unusual. Historical evidence shows that frontier communities often relied on shared cooking during harsh weather, especially when travel between cabins became difficult. Combining resources reduced risk for everyone involved. The stew begins modestly, as most frontier meals do. Water grain and legumes form the base. Then additions follow, slowly each one extending the reach of the others. The result is something far more sustaining than any single ingredient could have managed on its own. You stir the pot and notice how conversation follows the same pattern. No grand speeches, just practical exchanges. How much wood remains, whether the trail is passable, who might try hunting when the wind calms. The act of cooking together fills the cabin with more than heat. It creates reassurance. If one family's stores begin to run low, others are aware. Cooperation becomes a form of insurance long before any formal systems existed. A small but memorable anecdote from a frontier settlement tells of neighbours marking shared meals by carving a simple notch on a wooden ladle each time it was used communally. Over time, the utensil became covered in marks, a quiet record of winters survived together. The stew thickens, gradually absorbing contributions from each household. No one worries about exact measurements. The goal is balance, not precision. A little more water if it grows too dense. Another handful of grain if it seems thin. Researchers continue to explore how these informal networks shaped survival rates during severe winters. Some historians believe cooperation was a decisive factor in whether isolated settlements endured or disappeared. Others suggest individual household management mattered just as much. The discussion remains open, shaped by scattered records and personal accounts. You sit near the hearth, listening to the layered sounds of cooking and quiet conversation. The scent rising from the pot is richer now, not because of luxury ingredients, but because of variety. Each addition brings a slightly different character. Meals like this stretch supplies remarkably well. What might have fed one family for 2 days can help several families for the same amount of time. Efficiency grows out of shared effort. There is also an emotional dimension. Eating together interrupts the isolation that winter imposes. Long nights feel shorter when voices fill the space, even if they are speaking softly. You notice how carefully leftovers are handled. Nothing is discarded. The pot may be replenished again tomorrow, building on what remains, rather than starting from scratch. This continuous cooking conserves fuel and effort. Another lesser-known detail appears in letters from the period describing how shared meals often rotated locations, so no single household bore the burden of hosting repeatedly. Even in hardship, fairness mattered. The fire burns steadily as bowls are filled and passed around. Steam curls upward, carrying warmth to faces grown pale from weeks indoors. Outside, snow continues to fall indifferent to the small circle of cooperation inside. You take a spoonful and realise that the flavour is less about ingredients and more about accumulation. Each contribution, however modest, has made the meal stronger. Communal cooking reflects a broader frontier reality. Survival rarely depended on solitary endurance. It depended on overlapping efforts, shared knowledge, and the willingness to combine what little each person had. As the meal continues, the large kettle remains at the centre of everything, a symbol of both practicality and connection. It is not elegant, it is not refined, yet it sustains more than bodies. When the last bowls are scraped clean, the pot is not washed immediately. A bit of broth remains inside, ready to welcome tomorrow's additions. In this way, the meal never truly ends. It simply evolves. You lean back, feeling warmth spread slowly through you, aware that winter still has many weeks to offer. But tonight, at least the burden has been shared, and that sharing has made the cold feel just a little less absolute. Sooner or later, you encounter a food that seems almost legendary among pioneers, spoken of with a mixture of respect and mild dread. Hardtack. It sits stacked in a tin or wrapped in cloth, pale and square, looking more like a building material than something meant to be eaten. You pick one up and immediately understand its reputation. It is solid. Not firm, not dense, solid. The kind of solid that makes you wonder whether it was baked or carved. Historically, hardtack was widely used not only by settlers, but also by soldiers and sailors because it could last for years, if kept dry. Made from little more than flour, water, and sometimes salt, it was baked repeatedly to remove nearly all moisture, creating a food that resisted spoilage almost indefinitely. To eat it, you cannot simply bite in, that would test even the strongest teeth. Instead, you soften it by dipping it into coffee broth or water, allowing it to absorb liquid slowly. Only then does it begin to resemble bread again. You place a piece into a steaming cup and watch as tiny bubbles escape from its surface. The transformation takes patience, another reminder that frontier meals rarely happen quickly. Some pioneers joke that hardtack had two uses in nourishment and construction, claiming it could patch a wall as effectively as it could fill a stomach. While exaggerated, the humour reflected how durable these biscuits really were. Once softened, it becomes surprisingly filling. Its simplicity makes it a reliable companion to stews or beans, stretching those dishes further. A single piece can absorb a remarkable amount of liquid, turning even a small serving into something more substantial. You notice how carefully it is stored. Moisture is its only real enemy. If kept dry, it remains edible through an entire winter and beyond. That reliability gave travellers confidence when other foods ran low. Scholars still examine how often hardtack appeared on civilian tables compared to military rations. Some argue it was more common during journeys than in settled cabins, while others point to records showing families baking their own versions for long-term storage. The truth likely varied from region to region. You take a bite after it has softened enough, finding the flavour plain but comforting, almost neutral. It does not compete with other foods, which is precisely why it works so well as a base. Another small historical curiosity involves people tapping hardtack pieces on the table before eating them to check for hidden insects that might have found their way inside during storage. The practice became so routine that it earned the nickname knockbread in some communities. The fire crackles as you prepare more pieces, lining them near bowls of stew. Their presence adds bulk to the meal without requiring extra fuel or preparation. Efficiency again proves to be the guiding principle. You begin to see how foods like this served as insurance. When weather prevented hunting and supplies dwindled, hardtack remained dependable and ready. It might not inspire excitement, but it provided certainty. The texture, once softened, becomes almost creamy when mixed into hot broth. It thickens the liquid, creating something closer to porridge. That adaptability allowed pioneers to reshape the same basic ingredients into different experiences. Outside, the sky darkens early again, pressing another long night against the cabin walls. Inside, the combination of stew and softened biscuit feels steady, predictable, and reassuring. You realise that hardtack represents a kind of culinary patience. It asks little during preparation, waits quietly in storage, and requires only time and warmth to become edible again. In a season where time stretches endlessly, that quality fits perfectly. As the meal ends remaining, pieces are wrapped carefully and returned to their container, ready to serve again whenever needed. Nothing about them suggests luxury, yet their endurance mirrors the people who rely on them. You settle back near the fire, feeling the familiar warmth spread through you, sustained by food designed not to delight but to last. Winter continues outside, indifferent as ever, but inside another simple meal has done its work. And tomorrow, if necessary, those same unassuming squares will once again soften beside the hearth, proving that even the plainest provisions can help carry you through the coldest days. As much as solid food sustains the body, you soon discover that what pioneers drank mattered just as much during the winter months. Warmth could be swallowed as well as eaten, and a hot cup held between cold hands often felt like its own kind of meal. You watch as a kettle is filled with melted snow and set carefully over the coals. Water must always be heated before use, not only for comfort, but because freezing temperatures make even simple tasks more difficult. The wait becomes part of the routine. Coffee, when available, is treated with particular appreciation. By the early 19th century, it had become a familiar beverage for many American settlers carried west in precious quantities because it provided both warmth and a gentle boost of alertness during long, demanding days. The grounds are added sparingly, supplies are limited, and no one wants to run out too soon. The smell that rises from the pot is rich and almost startling after weeks dominated by the scent of grains and salt meat. You notice how everyone seems to pause a little when that aroma fills the cabin. Even the act of breathing it in feels restorative. Yet coffee was not always plentiful. When it ran low, pioneers improvised. Roasted chicory root dandelion or even burnt grain could be brewed as substitutes. These drinks mimicked the colour and bitterness of coffee, offering comfort even if the flavour differed. A curious note from several frontier accounts mentions families carefully saving used coffee grounds to dry and reuse them for a second or even third brewing. The result was weaker certainly, but still welcome on a cold morning. You pour a cup and hold it close, letting the heat seep into your fingers before taking a sip. The warmth travels slowly through you, spreading from throat to chest like a small internal fire. Historians continue to discuss how important these beverages were to morale rather than nutrition. While they contributed little in terms of calories, they provided psychological relief, breaking the monotony of winter and marking moments of rest. That emotional benefit may have been just as valuable as any physical nourishment. Tea sometimes appeared as well, especially among families who had brought it from eastern markets. Like coffee, it was rationed carefully brewed light but cherished. Even plain hot water held significance. Drinking something warm helped maintain body temperature, and settlers often flavoured it with a touch of molasses or herbs when available. Another lesser-known habit involved passing a single cup around the hearth when supplies were scarce. Each person took a turn warming hands as much as sipping. The gesture reinforced a sense of shared endurance. You sit quietly with your cup now, listening to the faint hiss of the kettle and the low murmur of wind outside. The act of drinking encourages stillness, a rare pause in days filled with chores and calculations. Unlike cooking, which demanded attention, brewing required waiting. That waiting created moments to reflect, to rest muscles, to simply exist beside the fire without urgency. The drink itself is simple, yet it changes the atmosphere of the room. Shoulders relax, conversation grows easier. Even the crackling fire seems to sound softer. You begin to understand why these warm beverages became daily rituals. They offered structure and reassurance, small predictable comforts in a season defined by uncertainty. As the kettle is refilled for another round, you notice how carefully every resource is managed. Nothing is wasted. The same water might serve several uses before being discarded, each one planned thoughtfully. Outside dusk arrives once more, blending sky and snow into a single pale horizon. Inside, the glow of embers reflects off tin cups and worn wood, creating a sense of enclosure against the vast cold beyond the walls. You take another sip, slower this time, letting the warmth linger. It is not extravagant. It is not complex, but it is enough. And in a winter where enough is the measure of success, that simple cup becomes one more quiet ally in the long effort to stay warm, stay steady, and keep going until spring. After many weeks of meals built on grains, beans, and preserved meat, you begin to notice how even the smallest trace of sweetness feels extraordinary. Sugar in its refined form is rare here, often too expensive or too difficult to transport in large amounts. Yet there is one ingredient that appears again and again in careful treasured portions: molasses. You lift a small jug and feel its weight heavier than it looks. Inside is a dark, slow-moving syrup made during the sugar refining process. It pours reluctantly, clinging to the spoon, catching the firelight with a deep amber shine. Historically, molasses became a common sweetener for early American settlers because it was more affordable and easier to ship than refined sugar. It also stored well without spoiling, which made it especially valuable for long winters when fresh foods were scarce. A spoonful is added to a pot of cornmeal or spread thinly over bread. Not much is needed. Its flavour is strong, rich and slightly smoky, capable of transforming the plainest dish into something that feels almost indulgent. You watch as it dissolves into hot porridge, turning the surface a warm brown. The scent that rises is comforting in a way difficult to describe. After so many savoury meals, the hint of sweetness feels like a reminder that pleasure has not entirely disappeared from daily life. Molasses also provided quick energy, something pioneers valued during physically demanding tasks. Though they would not have explained it scientifically, they understood that this dense syrup gave strength that lasted. A small but telling detail appears in some household journals describing molasses being kept in a special place rather than with other supplies. It was treated less like a staple and more like a reserve for difficult days or moments when morale needed lifting. You taste a small amount on its own, noticing how it warms the throat and leaves a lingering richness. Even that modest portion seems to change the tone of the meal. Researchers still explore how frequently sweeteners like molasses were used on the frontier. Some suggest it was an occasional luxury, while others argue it appeared regularly in cooking because of its affordability compared to sugar. The answer likely varied depending on trade access and regional habits. In addition to flavour, molasses help diversify otherwise repetitive diets. Added to baked goods or stirred into drinks, it created variation without requiring entirely new ingredients. Another lesser-known practice involved mixing molasses with hot water to create a simple beverage, sometimes given to children or labourers needing quick warmth. It was not fancy, but it was effective and easy to prepare. You notice how carefully the jug is sealed after use. Even a small spill would feel like a significant loss. Every drop represents effort somewhere else, perhaps harvested far away and carried over long distances before reaching this cabin. The fire burns steadily as the meal continues, now carrying a faint sweetness that lingers in the air. It softens the atmosphere, making the space feel less austere. You begin to realise that foods like molasses played an emotional role as much as a nutritional one. They provided contrast, a break in sameness that helped people maintain a sense of normalcy. Outside, the wind eases for a moment, leaving a rare stillness across the snow-covered land. Inside, that small sweetness seems to echo the calm, a gentle balance against the severity of winter. You finish the meal slowly, aware that such flavours cannot be taken for granted. They are measured, rationed and appreciated in ways that modern abundance rarely demands. As the jug is returned to its place, you understand why pioneers valued it so highly. It was more than a sweetener. It was a reminder that survival did not have to be entirely joyless. And when the next cold morning arrives, another careful spoonful may once again find its way into the pot, carrying with it a bit of comfort strong enough to face the long day ahead. On days when luck, skill and timing align, the cabin fills with a different kind of anticipation. A successful hunt has brought in fresh game, and now the challenge becomes turning that tough, lean meat into something both edible and warming. The answer more often than not is stew. You watch as the meat is cut into small pieces, each one examined carefully so nothing is wasted. Unlike the fatty salt pork used regularly, wild game tends to be leaner, which means it must be cooked slowly to avoid becoming hard and dry. Historical cooking practices show that pioneers relied heavily on long simmering methods for venison, rabbit and other wild meats because slow cooking broke down connective tissue and made the food easier to digest. A pot left over the fire for hours could transform even the toughest cut into something tender. The iron kettle is filled with water first, then beans or grains to form a base. The meat is added gradually along with whatever preserved vegetables or herbs are available. The process is patient and deliberate, allowing flavours to develop over time. You notice how the scent differs from everyday meals. There is a freshness to it, something that hints at forests and open land beyond the cabin walls. Even before tasting, you can sense the change. The stew must be watched closely but not rushed. Too much heat wastes fuel and toughens the meat. Too little slows the cooking and risks underdone food. Managing that balance becomes almost instinctive after weeks of practice. One small anecdote from frontier life describes families calling these rare meals hunters' blessings, not in a formal religious sense, but as an acknowledgement that nature had briefly cooperated. The phrase carried gratitude without ceremony. You stir the pot and see the broth deepen in colour, thickened by grains and enriched by marrow released from the bones. This combination makes the dish especially sustaining, perfect for restoring strength after cold labour. Historians still debate how much wild game contributed to overall nutrition during winter months. Some records suggest it played only a supplemental role, while others describe seasons when hunting became essential due to crop shortages. Conditions varied so widely that no single answer fits every settlement. As the stew cooks, conversation often turns practical. How long this supply might last, whether weather will allow another hunt soon. Each meal connects directly to planning the next. You take a moment to taste the broth, noticing how it carries both the familiarity of stored ingredients and the distinct character of the fresh meat. It feels like a meeting between preparation and opportunity. Another lesser-known detail appears in accounts of hunters deliberately bringing back bones along with meat, even when weight made the journey harder. Bones were prized for making stock, which added nutrients and extended meals far beyond the initial catch. You add those bones to the kettle, letting them simmer alongside everything else. Over time, they release flavour and richness that would otherwise be lost. Outside, the light fades early again, painting the snow in muted shades of grey. Inside, the steady bubbling of the stew becomes almost hypnotic, marking the passage of time in soft sounds rather than visible change. When it is finally served, the meal feels both hearty and restorative. Each bowl carries warmth, spreads gradually easing, muscles tightened by cold and effort. You realise that dishes like this represent moments of balance in a difficult season. Stored foods provide reliability. Hunting provides renewal. Together they create meals capable of sustaining both body and spirit. As the last portions are ladled out, the remaining broth is saved carefully for tomorrow. Nothing about the process encourages waste. Every success must be stretched as far as possible. The fire settles into a steady glow as evening deepens. Outside, winter remains vast and unmoved. Inside, however, the work of turning raw game into nourishment has created another small victory. You sit quietly, feeling the lingering warmth of the stew, aware that such moments are never taken for granted. They are earned, unpredictable, and deeply valued. And as the kettle is cleaned and returned to its hook, ready for the next long simmer, you understand why this method of cooking became so central to frontier survival. It turned uncertainty into sustenance, one slow meal at a time. Life inside the cabin shapes how every meal is prepared, eaten, and even imagined. Space is limited, light is scarce, and heat gathers unevenly, creating a small world where cooking and living blend into one continuous activity. You begin to realise that winter food is not just influenced by ingredients, but by the structure of the shelter itself. You look around the single room that serves as kitchen, dining area and sleeping quarters. Hooks hold pots above the hearth. Utensils rest within arm's reach, so no one has to cross the cold floor more than necessary. Every movement is planned to conserve warmth. Historical descriptions of frontier cabins confirm that many families lived in 1 or 2 room structures, where the hearth formed the literal and social centre of daily life. Cooking had to adapt to these close quarters, using methods that required minimal space and equipment. Meals are often prepared while other tasks continue nearby. Someone mends clothing by firelight. Another shapes wooden tools. Children sit close to the warmth, listening to the sounds of simmering pots. The process of making food becomes background to everything else. You notice how carefully smoke is managed. Too much and the room becomes stifling. Too little and the fire loses strength. Adjusting logs and coals becomes almost like tending a living thing, coaxing it to behave. One lesser-known detail recorded in some pioneer accounts mentions that families sometimes rearranged sleeping areas in winter so that beds were closer to the hearth, allowing both warmth and the scent of cooking to reach them. The mingling of rest and food preparation was simply part of survival. You stir a pot positioned slightly to one side of the flames, using a spot that provides steady heat without boiling too fiercely. These subtle adjustments make all the difference in meals that must cook slowly over hours. The limited space also encourages efficiency. Ingredients are added in sequence because there is rarely room to prepare multiple dishes at once. A single pot may handle the entire meal from start to finish. Researchers still examine how these living conditions influence frontier cuisine. Some argue that the reliance on one-pot cooking arose directly from spatial constraints, while others believe it reflected older European traditions carried into the new environment. Either way, the cabin reinforced habits that favoured simplicity and endurance. You taste the stew and shift it slightly closer to the heat, responding to instinct more than measurement. Cooking here is guided by observation, not written instruction. Outside wind presses against the walls, but inside the cabin holds its small pocket of warmth. The closeness of the space creates a sense of shared experience. Everyone feels the same heat, smells the same food, and waits for the same meal. Another small anecdote tells of visitors recognizing a household's cooking style simply by stepping through the door and smelling what hung in the air. Each cabin developed its own familiar blend of smoke grain and meat, a scent that lingered through the season. You sit down with a bowl, careful not to stray too far from the fire. Even during meals, proximity to warmth matters. Plates cool quickly if carried across the room, so eating near the hearth becomes habit. This arrangement shapes the pace of life. Meals are slower, not out of leisure, but necessity. Standing, serving, and cleaning all happen within the same small radius. You begin to see how architecture and appetite intertwine. The design of the cabin encourages foods that can simmer unattended, stay warm for long periods, and be served easily without elaborate preparation. The fire crackles softly as another log is added, sending a brief glow across the walls. Shadows shift, revealing the textures of wood and iron that define this interior world. In such surroundings, food is never separate from shelter. The same flames that cook also protect. The same pot that feeds also humidifies the dry winter air. Every element works together. As night deepens, bowls are emptied and set aside, but the hearth remains active, ready for the next use. There is no clear boundary between meals, only a steady continuation of heat, effort, and nourishment. You settle into the rhythm of this enclosed space, understanding that winter living requires adaptation, not just to climate, but to confinement. And within these walls, where every inch matters, the simplest foods become perfectly suited companions to a life built on closeness, care, and constant attention to the fire that makes it all possible. As you continue through the long winter, you begin to notice how much of the work surrounding food happens quietly, often without recognition. Meals appear on the table, pots are always ready, supplies seem to last just long enough. Yet behind this steady rhythm is a pattern of constant labour, much of it carried out by the women of the household. From before dawn until well after dark, tasks related to food rarely stop. Grain must be measured and sometimes reground, beans sorted and soaked, water hauled and melted, cooking fires maintained with careful attention. Each action looks small on its own, but together they form the structure that keeps everyone alive. Historical records consistently show that women on the frontier were primarily responsible for food preparation and preservation, even while also managing childcare, clothing production, and other domestic work. Their role in maintaining winter sustenance was essential, though often described in understated ways. You watch as ingredients are checked again, not because anyone doubts their presence, but because planning ahead requires constant awareness. A missing scoop today could become a problem weeks later. The work demands organisation as much as strength. Knowing when to begin soaking beans or how much flour to reserve for later in the season involves foresight built through experience rather than written instruction. A lesser-known detail from several pioneer diaries mentions women keeping mental inventories so precise that they could estimate remaining supplies without opening containers. This skill saved time and prevented unnecessary exposure of food to moisture or pests. You see this awareness in practice when a small portion is set aside rather than used. Nothing is random. Every decision connects to the long arc of winter. Researchers still discuss how accurately these contributions were recorded in historical narratives. Some scholars argue that traditional accounts focused heavily on exploration and settlement, while overlooking the daily labour that sustained communities. Others believe personal journals provide a clearer picture, revealing how central this work truly was. As the day progresses, meals are prepared in stages. A pot started in the morning becomes supper by evening. Leftovers are transformed rather than discarded. This continuous cycle reduces effort while maximising resources. You notice how even moments of rest are tied to food preparation. Sitting near the hearth might involve shelling dried beans or mending storage sacks. Work blends seamlessly into what might otherwise be leisure. Another anecdote survives from a frontier letter, describing how a woman once joked that winter cooking felt like tending an endless conversation with the fire. The fire asked for wood, the pot asked for stirring, the family asked for meals, and she answered each request in turn. You stir alongside her now, realizing how repetitive motions create a sense of calm despite their necessity. The act of preparing food becomes almost meditative, a steady anchor against the unpredictability outside. The cabin smells of grain and smoke once again familiar and reassuring. These scents mark continuity proof that the daily system is functioning. You begin to understand that survival was not achieved through dramatic acts alone, but through persistence in these ordinary routines. Measuring, stirring, storing, repeating. Out to side, snow gathers, along the walls reshaping the landscape with each passing hour. Inside, the quiet labour continues largely unnoticed unless it falters. Meals appear on time because someone ensured they would. Supplies endure because someone planned their use carefully. Warmth spreads because someone kept the fire alive long enough to cook. As evening comes, bowls are filled and passed around, the result of hours of preparation condensed into a simple act of eating. The work behind it is invisible once the meal begins, yet it remains present in every bite. You sit with that awareness, recognizing how much depends on consistency rather than spectacle. And as the fire glows steadily into the night, you see how these unseen efforts form one of the strongest foundations of winter survival, sustaining not only bodies, but the fragile rhythm of daily life itself. At the winter table, you begin to notice how children adapt to this steady, practical diet just as much as the adults do. Their presence changes the atmosphere of meals, bringing small moments of energy into days otherwise measured and quiet. You watch as portions are served carefully adjusted for smaller hands and growing bodies. Food must stretch to feed everyone, yet children require enough nourishment to stay healthy through the demanding season. Historical accounts of frontier families emphasize that feeding children during winter was a particular concern, since limited diets could affect growth if not managed thoughtfully. Parents often reserve the most nutrient-dense foods, such as broth enriched with meat or fat, for the youngest members of the household. A bowl of thick stew is placed in front of a child, cooled slightly, so it can be eaten slowly. The warmth rising from it is as important as the ingredients themselves, helping maintain body temperature in cabins that never fully escape the cold. You notice how meals become teaching moments. Children learn early not to waste food, to finish what they're given, and to understand that supplies must last. These lessons are not delivered as lectures. They are absorbed naturally through daily practice. One small story preserved in a pioneer memoir describes a boy proudly carrying kindling to the fire so supper could be cooked faster, believing he had directly helped create the meal. Such contributions, however modest, were encouraged because they reinforced a sense of shared responsibility. Winter limited opportunities for outdoor play, so children spent more time indoors, often close to the hearth where food was prepared. This proximity meant they observed cooking techniques from an early age, gaining familiarity with the processes that sustained them. Researchers still explore how childhood experiences on the frontier shaped lifelong attitudes toward food and resourcefulness. Some argue these early lessons fostered resilience and adaptability, while others suggest the hardships left lasting impressions of scarcity, even in later, more stable years. You see how variety, when it appears, excites genuine enthusiasm. A spoonful of molasses or a piece of rehydrated fruit feels like a celebration. Small differences stand out vividly against the background of repetition. Another lesser-known detail from letters of the time mentions parents using food tasks as informal education. Measuring cornmeal or counting beans became arithmetic lessons, blending survival skills with learning in a way that fit the environment. The cabin fills with quiet sounds of eating, occasional laughter, and the soft crackle of the fire. These moments create a sense of normalcy despite the harsh conditions outside. You realize that maintaining routine for children helped stabilize the entire household. Regular meals, even simple ones, provided reassurance that life continued in an orderly way. As bowls are refilled or scraped clean, the importance of balance becomes clear. Adults may accept monotony more easily, but children benefit from whatever small variations can be offered. A thicker stew one day, a corn cake the next, a slightly sweeter taste when supplies allow. Outside, dusk settles early again, pressing shadows against the snow. Inside, the glow of the hearth reflects in watchful eyes, seeing how this world works. You begin to understand that winter food was not only about endurance, but about continuity across generations. Skills, habits, and expectations passed quietly from one age group to another. As the meal ends, children drift toward blankets near the fire, warmed and fed, while preparations for the next day already begin. And in this steady cycle, you see how even the simplest dishes carry something more than nourishment. They carry knowledge, responsibility, and the promise that those who learn these rhythms will be able to face winters of their own someday. There are days when the careful plans made months earlier do not quite hold. A sack proves lighter than expected. A stored item spoils despite precautions. A storm delays hunting longer than anyone hoped. On those days, improvisation becomes as important as preparation. You stand before the larder studying what remains, thinking not in terms of recipes, but of possibilities. Frontier cooking often meant adapting familiar methods to whatever ingredients were still available. Historical sources describe settlers frequently substituting one staple for another. When supplies ran short, using cornmeal in place of flour, stretching stews with extra water, or combining unlikely ingredients simply to maintain volume. Flexibility was essential because certainty was rare. You take a smaller portion of beans than usual and add more grain to compensate. The change is subtle, but it allows the meal to feed everyone without drawing too heavily from dwindling stores. Improvisation also required creativity with flavour. A scrap of dried herb saved from autumn might be used sparingly to refresh a dish that otherwise tasted identical to yesterday's. One account from the frontier tells of a family grinding dried pumpkin into a coarse powder and mixing it into their meal when flour ran low. The result was not especially delicious, yet it added substance and kept hunger at bay. They reportedly joked that it was bread, remembering it was once a vegetable. You stir the pot and notice how texture shifts depending on what has been added. These variations become a quiet language signalling how resources are being managed without needing to say it aloud. Researchers still debate how often pioneers had to rely on such substitutions. Some believe shortages were frequent, especially in new settlements, while others argue that careful planning usually prevented extreme measures. Evidence differs widely depending on location and experience. Improvised meals often take longer to cook as unfamiliar combinations require adjustment. You watch closely, adding water or stirring, more often learning through observation rather than instruction. There is a certain ingenuity in this process. Constraints encourage experimentation, even if the goal is simply to create something edible and filling. Another lesser-known habit involves saving crumbs, broken bits of hardtack, or leftover mush to be reshaped and cooked again the next day. Nothing was discarded if it could be transformed into another meal. You realise that this constant reinvention helps stretch supplies psychologically as well as physically. Each new variation feels like progress even when ingredients remain the same. Outside, the wind shifts direction, carrying snow in thin streams across the ground. Inside, the fire continues its steady work, making adaptation possible. The meal that emerges may not resemble anything recorded in cookbooks yet. It serves its purpose, warm, sustaining, and sufficient. You sit with your bowl, recognizing that resilience often lies in these small adjustments. Knowing how to change without losing balance is as valuable as any single ingredient. Improvisation becomes a skill practiced daily, shaping how pioneers approach not just cooking, but life itself. Plans existed, but they were never rigid. Survival required responding to circumstances as they unfolded. As evening deepens, the remaining food is set aside carefully, already being considered for how it might be used tomorrow. And you see how this flexible approach allowed families to navigate uncertainty, turning whatever they had into something that could carry them forward another day through the long winter season. Even in the isolation of winter, you realise that no cabin truly survives alone. Paths between homesteads may be buried in snow, but when weather allows, people still make careful journeys to visit, exchange news, and sometimes trade food. These visits are rarely casual. They are purposeful, measured, and often essential. You pull on heavy clothing and step into the cold alongside a neighbour carrying a small bundle. The walk is slow guided by the landmarks barely visible beneath the white landscape. Each step must be placed deliberately to avoid hidden drifts or ice. Historical evidence shows that barter remained a common practice among frontier families, especially during winter months when formal markets were far away or unreachable. Goods such as flour, cured meat, or dried produce were exchanged directly, strengthening both supply and relationships. At another cabin, greetings are warm but brief. No one lingers long in the cold. Inside items are compared, discussed, and traded with quiet practicality. Bit of molasses for extra beans, a portion of cornmeal in exchange for smoked meat. You notice how fair these exchanges strive to be. Balance matters because everyone depends on continued goodwill. Taking too much or offering too little could damage trust needed for future help. One small anecdote from a frontier settlement tells of neighbours marking shared trades in a simple notebook, not as formal accounting but as a reminder of mutual support. The record helped ensure that kindness moved in both directions over time. These exchanges also bring news from beyond one household. Who has had success hunting? Which supplies are running low, whether the coming weeks might bring harsher weather? Researchers still examine how these informal trade networks functioned without structured systems. Some scholars argue they resembled small cooperative economies built on trust, while others see them as temporary adaptations to isolation. The interpretation depends on how communities documented their experiences. Back at your own cabin, the newly acquired ingredients are added to storage with care. Even small additions can extend meals significantly. You stir the evening pot, now containing a mixture that reflects more than one household's effort. The blending of foods mirrors the blending of cooperation that made the meal possible. Another lesser-known practice involved sharing starter cultures for bread or fermented foods, ensuring that even families who had lost theirs could continue baking. These exchanges were treated almost like passing along a living resource. The fire glows steadily as preparations continue. Outside, snow begins falling again, already softening the tracks left by the day's journey. You sit near the hearth and consider how trade reduced uncertainty. No family could prepare for every possibility alone, but together they could adjust to shortages and surprises. Meals gained through barter carry a subtle sense of connection. Each bite represents not just nourishment, but the willingness of others to share what they had. As bowls are filled and passed around, the atmosphere feels slightly lighter. Variety has returned, even if modestly, and with it comes reassurance that help exists beyond these walls. You begin to see that winter survival depended as much on relationships as on provisions. Food moved along lines of trust just as surely as it travelled in wagons months before. The night settles in quiet and cold, but inside the cabin, the results of cooperation simmer gently over the fire. And as you finish the meal, you understand that these small acts of exchange formed another invisible layer of protection against the season binding scattered households into something stronger than any one of them could manage alone. As winter continues, you begin to recognize that many of the foods and techniques sustaining these meals did not originate with the settlers themselves. Long before wagons arrived, indigenous communities had already developed deep knowledge of how to live through these same cold seasons. That knowledge, sometimes shared willingly and sometimes learned through observation, became quietly essential. You examine a pot of corn prepared in a way slightly different from earlier methods. The kernels have been treated to soften them and improve their nutritional value, a process that settlers gradually adopted after seeing it practiced by the native peoples. Historians widely acknowledge that indigenous agricultural and culinary knowledge influenced frontier survival, especially in the use of maize beans and preservation techniques suited to local climates. These foods, often called the Three Sisters, when grown together, provided balanced nourishment long before European arrival. You stir the mixture and notice its texture is smoother, more sustaining. The method extracts more benefit from the same cross, something settlers came to rely on during difficult winters. Learning did not always happen through formal instruction. Sometimes it was shared through trade or cooperation. Other times it was observed quietly and repeated later. Knowledge moved in subtle ways across cultural boundaries. A fascinating but less commonly discussed detail appears in some early accounts describing settlers adopting the use of groundnuts and seeds to enrich stews after seeing similar practices among native communities. These additions increased calories and improved flavour when other resources were scarce. You taste the result and feel how nourishing it is, denser than it appears. The blending of traditions created meals that neither culture would have prepared in exactly the same way alone. Researchers still debate how fully these exchanges are represented in written history. Some argue that indigenous contributions were under-recorded or minimised in later narratives, while others point to surviving journals that clearly describe learning and adaptation. The conversation remains active among scholars. Outside, the winter landscape stretches quiet and unchanged, yet the food inside tells a story of shared environment. Different peoples facing the same cold found solutions that overlap more than they differed. You add another handful of beans to the pot, appreciating how these crops complement one another nutritionally as well as practically. The pairing provides strength that lasts through long hours of work and exposure. Another anecdote recounts how some settlers initially resisted unfamiliar preparation methods, only to adopt them later when they proved effective during harsh seasons. Necessity has a way of softening skepticism. The fire crackles as you continue cooking its steady warmth, echoing practices that have existed on this land for generations. What feels like adaptation is in many ways participation in an older system of survival. Meals shaped by this shared knowledge often required fewer ingredients, yet delivered greater sustenance. Efficiency mattered especially when supplies dwindled. You sit down with a bowl and consider how food becomes a point of connection between cultures even in times marked by tension or misunderstanding. Techniques endure because they work. The taste is familiar now, though its origins stretch further back than the cabin walls. It carries both the settlers' preparations and the land's earlier wisdom. As evening approaches, the pot is left near the coals to remain warm, continuing a cycle that blends inherited habits with newly learned ones. And in that quiet continuation, you see how winter survival depended not only on what pioneers brought with them, but also on what they learned after arriving, drawing from knowledge rooted deeply in the very place they now struggle to endure. As the season presses on, there comes a time when even the most careful planning begins to feel strained. You open storage containers and notice the subtle but undeniable signs of reduction. Sacks that once felt heavy now lift easily. Barrels echo faintly when touched. Nothing is empty yet, but everything is moving in that direction. This period, often called the lean stretch of winter-tested pioneer households more than the early storms. Historical accounts frequently describe late winter as the most difficult phase, when preserved supplies had been used for months and fresh sources were still weeks away. You measure ingredients more deliberately now. A smaller scoop of cornmeal, fewer beans added to the pot. These adjustments are made quietly without announcement, but everyone notices. The fire remains steady, yet meals grow slightly thinner. More broth, more grain, less meat. The goal shifts from comfort to conservation. One revealing note from a settler's journal describes this time as the season of careful spoons, when every serving was considered before leaving the pot. The phrase captures how attention to detail became a daily necessity. You stir slowly, allowing the food to stretch as far as possible. Cooking techniques adapt again, favouring longer simmering to draw maximum nourishment from each ingredient. Researchers still examine how families psychologically manage this stage of winter. Some evidence suggests that routine and shared meals helped reduce anxiety, while other records reveal worry about whether stores would truly last until spring. The emotional experience likely varied from household to household. You notice that nothing edible is overlooked. Bones are boiled again for broth. Crumbs are saved. Even the water used to cook is reused when possible. Another lesser-known practice involved adding toasted grain to soups to create the impression of richness even when actual supplies were limited. This small trick helped maintain morale as much as nutrition. Outside, the snow begins to soften slightly during brief midday thaws, only to freeze again at night. These subtle changes hint that the season will eventually turn, though not quickly enough to ease present concerns. Inside, the rhythm continues. Fire tended, pot filled, meals shared. The repetition itself becomes reassuring proof that the system still works. You take a bowl and realise that while portions are smaller, the warmth they provide remains just as important. Hunger is held at bay even if abundance is no longer possible. This stage of winter reveals the full importance of earlier preparation. Every preserved item, every careful exchange, every improvised meal has helped extend supplies to this point. You also see how cooperation strengthens again. Neighbours check on one another, ensuring no one has reached the bottom of their stores unnoticed. Even modest sharing can prevent serious hardship. Historians continue to debate how often true starvation threatened frontier communities versus how often fear of it shaped behaviour. The line between caution and crisis is not always clear in the records left behind. As evening settles, you watch the pot simmer with renewed attentiveness, knowing that each meal must now carry you closer to the thaw. And though the larder is no longer as full as it once seemed, the habits built throughout the winter continue to sustain you, guiding each careful choice as the long season slowly, steadily moves toward its end. By this point in the winter, you notice something that has little to do with quantity and everything to do with repetition. The meals continue to sustain you, yet their sameness begins to settle into the mind. Day after day of cornmeal beans and preserved meat can weigh on a person in ways that are not immediately visible. You sit with a bowl that looks very much like yesterday's and the day before that. It is warm and filling, exactly what is needed, yet your thoughts wander to flavours that will not return until spring. This feeling was not uncommon. Personal writings from settlers often mention what modern observers might call flavour fatigue. The weariness that comes from eating the same foods for extended periods. Though the meals were appreciated, people still longed for change, fresh produce, or even different textures. To counter this, small variations become surprisingly meaningful. A different cooking method, a pinch of dried herbs saved for later in the season. Even browning cornmeal before boiling it could create a new taste. You try that now, toasting a portion lightly in the pan before adding water. The aroma shifts, becoming nuttier and more complex. Such a small change, yet it transforms the experience. One diary entry from the era humorously described a family celebrating when the cereal bread burned slightly because it finally tasted different. The comment was written half-jokingly, yet it reveals how strongly people noticed even accidental variety. Researchers still explore how monotony influenced morale during long winters. Some argue that structured routines helped people cope, while others suggest the lack of diversity in food contributed to feelings of isolation. Both interpretations appear in historical evidence. You stir the altered mixture and see how colour alone can make it feel like something new. Visual change mattered when daily surroundings rarely shifted. Conversation during meals sometimes turns to memories of past harvests or hopes for future ones. Talking about food not currently available became a way to imagine the coming seasons, keeping anticipation alive. Another lesser-known habit involved setting aside a tiny reserve of certain ingredients specifically to use later when spirits felt lowest. That intentional delay turned ordinary food into something closer to a reward. You taste the toasted meal and feel an unexpected lift. It is still simple, still familiar, yet the difference is enough to break the pattern for a moment. Outside, the sour crust softens slightly again under pale sunlight. Signs of change remain faint, but they are there if you look carefully. Inside, the fire continues to anchor the day and meals continue to follow their steady cycle. Yet now you understand that winter survival is not only physical, it is also about managing the mind's response to sameness. The act of altering a recipe, however slightly, becomes an expression of resilience. You are not merely enduring repetition, you are shaping it. As evening approaches, bowls are filled once more, and though the ingredients remain largely unchanged, the effort to vary them has renewed a sense of engagement. And in that subtle shift you see how pioneers balance necessity with creativity, finding ways to make the same supplies feel just different enough to carry them through another stretch of the long quiet season. Then, almost unexpectedly, there comes a day when the weather loosens its grip just enough to allow something unusual. The sky clears, the wind settles, travel between cabins becomes possible without struggle. These brief pauses in the season feel like small holidays, even though the calendar marks nothing special. You step outside and notice the difference immediately. The cold is still present, but it no longer bites quite as sharply. Smoke rises straight into the air from chimneys instead of being torn sideways by gusts. On days like this, families sometimes prepared slightly more elaborate meals. not because supplies were suddenly abundant, but because the moment allowed it. Historical descriptions note that settlers occasionally marked fair weather with what they called a little feast, using modest extra ingredients saved for such opportunities. Back inside, preparations take on a lighter tone. A bit more cornmeal is used than usual. A larger portion of preserved meat is added to the pot. Perhaps those dried apples saved earlier make another appearance. You help stir the mixture, noticing how anticipation changes the mood. The act of cooking feels less like routine maintenance and more like an event. One account from a frontier community describes neighbours gathering during a rare thaw to share a combined meal outdoors, standing rather than sitting because snow still covered the ground. The novelty of eating together under open sky stayed in memory long after winter ended. You add a small drizzle of molasses, enough to sweeten without waste. The aroma becomes richer, signalling that this meal, though still simple, carries a sense of occasion. Researchers still discuss how often such moments occurred and whether they had measurable effects on morale. Some scholars argue that even infrequent celebrations helped maintain emotional resilience during isolation, while others suggest they were practical responses to temporary mobility. Either way, they stood out sharply against the monotony of the season. You taste the food and notice how satisfying it feels when eaten without urgency. There is time to sit, to talk, to notice the warmth rather than rushing back to tasks. Another lesser-known custom involved using these calmer days to cook foods that required more attention, such as breads baked in heavier pots or dishes that needed steady supervision. The extra effort felt worthwhile when weather cooperated. Outside sunlight reflects off the snow so brightly it almost seems like early spring, though you know winter has not truly ended. Still, the brightness alone changes how everything feels. Children play nearby for a short while, their laughter carrying farther in the still air. Adults exchange news, inspect tools, and breathe deeply as if storing up the calm for the next storm. Meals like this do not consume more resources than necessary, but they are arranged with care. A better portion here, a slightly fuller bowl there. Enough to acknowledge the day's difference without jeopardizing future needs. You realize that these small feasts served as markers, reminders that time was moving forward even when days often felt identical. As afternoon fades, preparations return gradually to normal patterns. The pot is scraped clean, leftovers are saved, supplies are checked once more. The clear weather may not last, but its effect lingers. Spirits feel steadier. The long winter seems a little more manageable after a pause like this, and as evening settles again you carry the memory of this modest celebration, knowing that even brief moments of abundance or ease helped pioneers continue through the final demanding weeks before the season would finally begin to change. Now the season edges toward what many pioneers considered the most uncertain time of all. Late winter, sometimes called the thin season, arrives quietly. Snow still covers the ground, yet supplies are at their lowest and patience is stretched nearly as far as the remaining food. You open the larder again and see space where fullness once was. Containers are not empty, but they require careful handling. Every portion must bridge the narrowing distance between now and the first signs of spring planting. Historical accounts frequently describe this period as the moment when planning met reality. If stores had been managed well, families endured with caution. If miscalculated, they faced genuine hardship before new crops could grow. Meals become simpler again. More grain, less meat. Soups are extended with water and thickened slowly to maintain substance. Even the act of stirring seems quieter, more deliberate. You measure ingredients with close attention, noticing how instinct now guides your hands. Months of repetition have taught you exactly how much is needed without excess. One journal entry from the era referred to this stage as waiting weather, when people watched the landscape as carefully as they watched their pots, hoping for change in both. Outside sunlight lingers slightly longer each afternoon. Icicles form along the cabin roof, melting a little during the day and freezing again overnight. These small cycles hint at transition, though they offer no immediate relief. Researchers still debate how communities gauge the approach of spring without modern calendars or forecasts. Some suggest observation of animal behaviour or subtle environmental shifts provided guidance, while others argue that people relied more on tradition and experience than precise indicators. Inside the fire remains central, but fuel must also be managed carefully. Cooking methods adjust again to conserve wood, favouring dishes that require steady heat rather than intense flames. Another lesser-known practice involved mixing the last of stored vegetables with grains to create meals that symbolically used up winter's reserves, preparing households mentally for the coming season of growth. You taste the stew and sense both familiarity and restraint. It is enough, but no more than enough. Conversation often turns toward future plans now. What to plant first, repairs needed once weather softens. These discussions do not ignore present needs, but they lean forward, anchoring hope in practical thought. The rhythm of eating continues to mark each day, though anticipation grows alongside it. Every meal consumed is one step closer to relying on fresh resources again. You begin to understand how this final stretch tested endurance differently from earlier storms. It demanded patience rather than strength, careful management rather than bold action. As evening falls, the cabin feels both worn and resilient, shaped by months of steady living. The same hearth that warmed the first winter meal still glows, though the supplies beside it have thinned. And while the land outside remains locked in cold, the knowledge that change is approaching begins to settle quietly among those gathered inside, carried in each measured spoonful that must last just a little longer. At last, the shift comes not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual softening. You notice it first in the way the air feels less sharp when you step outside, then in the slow dripping of meltwater from branches and roof edges. Winter is loosening its hold, though it has not yet fully departed. Inside the cabin, meals continue much as before, drawn from the final reserves. Yet something about them feels different now. Each bowl no longer represents endurance alone. It marks the closing chapter of a long season. Historical reflections from settlers often describe this period as one of cautious relief, when families could see that their stores had lasted just long enough. The success of those preserved foods, shared meals, and careful preparations became clear only at winter's end. You prepare another pot of cornmeal and beans, familiar motions carried out almost automatically. The smells, the sounds, the warmth of the fire all feel like old companions. There is also time now to reflect. The routines that once felt endless reveal their purpose. Every salted cut of pork, every dried apple, every scoop of grain helped form a chain of small decisions that led to this moment. Some settlers recorded unusual celebratory habits once the worst had passed. One account tells of families intentionally cooking the last of a winter store in a single shared meal, not out of wastefulness, but as a symbolic farewell to the hardships they had endured. Researchers still explore how memory shaped these experiences. Did pioneers recall winters as harsher than they were, or did survival lend them a sense of accomplishment that softened recollection? The evidence suggests both pride and exhaustion lingered together. You step outside again and notice patches of ground beginning to show through the snow. It is not yet planting season, but it is close enough to imagine. The landscape that once seemed frozen beyond change now hints at motion and renewal. Back inside, the final meals of winter are prepared with steady care. Even at the end, nothing is taken lightly. Supplies may be nearly spent, but habits remain strong. Another lesser-known observation from frontier writings describes people keeping certain winter recipes long after they no longer needed them, preparing the same simple dishes years later as reminders of perseverance. You sit with your bowl near the hearth, feeling warmth spread slowly through you, aware that this may be one of the last times such food is eaten out of necessity rather than choice. The cabin is quieter now, not from worry, but from a kind of deep tiredness that follows sustained effort. Outside, melting snow falls in soft drops. Inside, the fire burns lower, no longer fighting quite so hard against the cold. And as the season gently fades, you realise that these meals, plain and repetitive as they seemed, carried far more than nourishment. They carried patience, ingenuity, cooperation, and the steady will to continue. The days ahead will bring new work of fresh crops and different challenges, but the memory of winter will remain held in the taste of cornmeal, the richness of slow stews, and the knowledge that survival often depends on the simplest things done well again and again. The fire settles into embers, the air feels softer, the long stretch of endurance gives way to rest. You breathe in the quiet, letting the sounds of dripping water and fading crackles blend together. There is no rush now, no storm pressing at the walls, just the gentle transition from one season to another. So you allow your thoughts to slow just as the pioneers might have done sitting beside the last warmth of the hearth, knowing they had made it through. Let the scene grow dim. Let the cabin fade into stillness. Let the memory of those steady meals drift like wood smoke into the cooling night. And with that calm image, you can rest too, carried by the same quiet resilience that brought them to spring. Sweet dreams.